When a gruff mountain man shocked the entire town of Millbrook by purchasing the one child, no orphanage could place a disabled girl named Maya that everyone had given up on, nobody could have predicted what would unfold in the harsh Montana wilderness of 1867. But what Ezra McCready discovered about strength, survival, and the true meaning of family in those unforgiving peaks would challenge everything the townspeople thought they knew about both the lonely trapper and the broken little girl he chose to save. What happens when two outcasts find each other in a world that has no place for either of them? The crack of gunfire echoed through the Montana mountains like thunder, sending a flock of ravens spiraling into the gray October sky. Ezra McCready lowered his rifle and watched the deer collapse among the golden aspen leaves, knowing this kill would keep him fed through the first snows of winter. But something felt different today, a restlessness in his bones that had nothing to do with the changing weather. The year was 1867, and the Montana Territory stretched wild and endless around his small cabin, perched on a ridge where few men dared to venture. Ezra had called this place home for 15 years, ever since he'd fled the memories that haunted him in the world below. Up here, among the peaks and pines, a man could disappear completely. He dressed the deer quickly, his weathered hands working with practiced skill. At 42, Ezra had grown lean and tough as jerky, his dark hair streaked with silver and his beard trimmed close to his jaw. His clothes, wool pants, cotton shirt, and a leather vest had been mended so many times they looked like patchwork quilts. But they were warm and sturdy, which mattered more than fashion in the high country. The pack horse snorted impatiently as Ezra loaded the meat, eager to return to familiar trails. But Ezra hesitated, studying the valley below where smoke rose from the chimneys of Millbrook. The small logging town had grown since his last visit, with new buildings sprouting like mushrooms after rain. Part of him wanted to avoid it entirely, to head straight back to his mountain sanctuary. But winter supplies wouldn't buy themselves. The ride down took most of the morning, winding through forests where the autumn colors blazed like fire. Ezra had always loved this season, the way the air turned crisp and clean, the way the mountains seemed to glow with inner light. It reminded him that even the harshest places could hold beauty, if you knew how to look for it. Millbrook bustled with activity when he finally reached its muddy streets. Lumberjacks stomped along the wooden sidewalks, their boots heavy with forest dirt. Women in long dresses picked their way carefully around puddles, lifting their skirts to avoid the muck. Children darted between wagons like minnows in a stream, their voices high and bright in the cool air. Ezra tied his horse to the rail outside Murphy's General Store and stepped onto the boardwalk. The familiar sounds and smells of civilization washed over him: coffee brewing, bread baking, horses stamping, voices calling. After months of mountain silence, it felt overwhelming. "Well, I'll be damned," called a voice from across the street. "If it isn't the ghost of the Rockies himself." Ezra turned to see Sheriff Bradley approaching, his tin star glinting in the afternoon sun. The two men had known each other for years, sharing an understanding born of mutual respect and careful distance. "Sheriff," Ezra nodded, touching the brim of his worn hat. "Haven't seen you since spring," Bradley said, falling into step beside him. "How's life treating you up there in the clouds?" "Can't complain," Ezra replied, which was his standard answer to such questions. The truth was more complicated, that some days the silence felt like peace, and other days like a prison. But such thoughts weren't meant for casual conversation. They passed the saloon, where piano music spilled through the swinging doors, along with the scent of whiskey and tobacco. A group of miners sat on the porch, their faces streaked with dirt and exhaustion. One of them nodded to Ezra, recognizing him as a fellow man of few words. "Town's changing," Sheriff Bradley observed, gesturing toward the new buildings. "More folks moving in every month. Railroad surveyors came through last week, talking about laying track this way." Ezra grunted noncommittally. Progress always seemed to find a way into the wilderness, like water seeping through rock. He'd seen it happen before: wild places tamed, mountains scarred by mining, forests cleared for farms. It was the way of things, but that didn't mean he had to like it. The general store smelled of leather and spices, coffee beans and soap. Mrs. Murphy stood behind the counter, her gray hair pinned up in a neat bun, her apron dusted with flour. She smiled when she saw Ezra, the kind of warm but respectful greeting she reserved for customers who paid their bills and caused no trouble. "Mr. McCready," she said, "what can I do for you today?" Ezra pulled a carefully written list from his pocket: coffee, salt, sugar, flour, beans, ammunition. The basics that would see him through until spring. He'd learned long ago to write things down. The isolation sometimes made his memory unreliable for details. As Mrs. Murphy gathered his supplies, Ezra became aware of a commotion outside. Raised voices, some angry, some mocking. Through the store's front window, he could see a crowd gathering in the town square. Mostly children, but with a few adults looking on from the edges. "What's all that about?" he asked. Mrs. Murphy's expression darkened. "Oh, that's just the orphanage children again. Some of them can be cruel." The word hung in the air like smoke. Ezra had known cruelty in his own childhood, the sharp tongues and harder fists of boys who smelled weakness like blood in the water. He'd thought such memories were buried deep enough to stay quiet. But as the shouts from outside grew louder, something stirred in his chest. A feeling he'd thought long dead, like coals that had been banked but never truly extinguished. "Stay here," Mrs. Murphy called as he moved toward the door. "It's not your concern." But Ezra was already stepping back onto the boardwalk, drawn by something he couldn't name. The crowd had formed a rough circle in the dusty square, and at its center huddled a small figure that made his breath catch in his throat. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. This child who sat curled against a wooden post like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Her dress was patched and faded, too big for her thin frame. Her dark hair hung in tangles around a face streaked with dirt and tears. But it was her leg that made Ezra's hands clench into fists twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly damaged from birth or injury. "Look at the cripple," one boy shouted, pointing and laughing. "Can't even stand up straight." "Bet she can't run neither," added another, larger child with cruel eyes. "What good is she to anybody?" The girl clutched something to her chest, a small wooden doll, worn smooth by countless hands. It was clearly precious to her, perhaps the only beautiful thing in a world that had shown her little kindness. "Please don't," she whispered when one of the boys reached for it. "She's all I have." But her words only seemed to encourage them. The largest boy snatched the doll away, holding it high above his head while the others cheered. The girl's cry of anguish cut through Ezra like a blade, sharp and deep and familiar. He'd heard that same sound before, long ago and far away. He'd made that sound himself once, when bigger boys had taken the only thing that mattered to him and broken it just because they could. The memory hit him like a physical blow himself at 10 years old, surrounded by the sons of his father's business partners, watching helplessly as they destroyed the wooden horse his mother had carved before her death. The same helplessness, the same cruelty, the same world that had no patience for anything different or weak. "That's enough." The words came from somewhere, deep in Ezra's chest, low and dangerous as a mountain storm. The children turned toward him, their laughter dying as they took in his tall frame and weathered face. Even the adults at the edges of the crowd seemed to shrink back, sensing something wild and unpredictable in his presence. Ezra stepped into the circle, his boots crunching on the packed dirt. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way he'd learned to approach spooked animals in the wilderness. His eyes never left the boy holding the doll. "Give it back," he said quietly. The boy, maybe 12 years old, with soft hands that spoke of a comfortable life, tried to maintain his bravado. "Says who? You don't own us, mountain man." "Give it back," Ezra repeated, his voice dropping even lower. Now, something in his tone must have penetrated the boy's false courage. He looked around for support from his friends, but they were already backing away, suddenly finding their shoes very interesting. The doll dropped from his nerveless fingers, hitting the ground with a soft thud. The girl scrambled forward despite her twisted leg, gathering the wooden figure to her chest like a mother protecting her child. She looked up at Ezra, with eyes the color of storm clouds, wary but not afraid, hurt but not broken. There was something in that gaze that reminded him of the wild creatures he'd encountered in the mountains, wounded but still fighting. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Ezra knelt down, bringing himself to her level. Up close, he could see that her face was thin from poor feeding, her clothes patched with different fabrics in a dozen places. But there was intelligence in her eyes, and a strength that hadn't been crushed despite everything she'd endured. "What's your name, child?" "Maya," she said, clutching her doll tighter. "Maya Clearwater." "That's a pretty name," Ezra said gently. like the mountain lakes up where I live, clear and deep and strong. A small smile flickered across her face, the first real expression of joy he'd seen from her. It transformed her completely, showing glimpses of the girl she might have been in a kinder world. "Mr. McCready?" Father Benedict's voice cut through the moment like an axe through wood. The priest hurried across the square, his round face flushed with embarrassment and exertion. "I'm so sorry about this disturbance. Children can be challenging to manage." Ezra stood slowly, his knees protesting after years of mountain living. He studied the priest, a soft man with kind eyes but weak hands, the sort who meant well but couldn't always follow through. "How long has she been with you?" Ezra asked, nodding toward Maya. 3 years now," Father Benedict said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "Poor thing was brought to us after her parents died in a logging accident. Her condition, well, it makes placement difficult." The words hit Ezra like physical blows. 3 years of rejection, of being passed over, of watching other children find families while she remained behind. He knew that particular pain intimately, the slow erosion of hope, the growing certainty that you were unwanted and unwantable. "She's not simple-minded," Ezra observed, watching as Maya carefully examined her doll for damage. "Oh no," Father Benedict agreed quickly. "Quite the opposite, actually. Maya's one of our brightest children. She reads well beyond her years, helps with the younger ones, never causes trouble. It's just her leg that—" He trailed off, as if saying the words might make them more real. Ezra looked down at Maya again. She was listening to every word, her face carefully blank, in the way children learned when their fate was being discussed around them. But he could see the hurt in her eyes, the resignation that came from hearing your worth debated like livestock at market. "I'll take her," he said suddenly. The words surprised even him. They'd come from somewhere deeper than thought, from the same place that had driven him to confront the cruel children. He hadn't planned to say them, hadn't considered the implications. They simply emerged like water from a spring, pure and unstoppable. Father Benedict blinked rapidly. "I beg your pardon?" "The girl, Maya, I'll take her." Ezra reached inside his coat, withdrawing the leather pouch that held his earnings from the fur trade. The coins clinked softly as he hefted its weight. "This should cover whatever paperwork you need." "But, Mr. McCready," Father Benedict sputtered, "surely you understand the challenges involved. A child with special needs, living in the wilderness. It's hardly suitable." "More suitable than this," Ezra replied, gesturing toward the scattered crowd of onlookers who were still staring and whispering. "At least the mountains don't judge a person for walking differently." Maya's head snapped up, her storm-gray eyes wide with something that might have been hope. You really want me?" The question broke something inside Ezra's chest. When had anyone last asked him what he wanted? When had he last allowed himself to want anything beyond mere survival? "Yes," he said simply. "I do." Father Benedict wrung his hands, clearly torn between his desire to see Maya placed and his doubts about the arrangement. "Perhaps we should discuss this more thoroughly. Your living situation, your experience with children. I've got a warm cabin, plenty of food, and more patience than most," Ezra said. "And I know what it's like to be different, to have folks look at you sideways and decide you're not worth their time." He pulled out a handful of gold coins, enough to keep the orphanage running for months. Father Benedict's eyes widened at the sight. "I'm not asking for charity," Ezra continued. "This is a business arrangement. You need homes for children. I need—" He paused, struggling to find words for feelings he'd kept buried for years. "I need someone to pass things on to. Someone who'll remember the mountains the way I do." Maya struggled to her feet, using the wooden post for support. Her twisted leg made her movements awkward, but she managed to stand with dignity and tact. "I won't be trouble," she said quietly. "I can cook some and mend clothes, and I know how to be quiet when folks need peace." The simple courage in her voice decided him completely. Here was a child who'd learned to sell herself for scraps of affection, who'd been taught that her worth lay in causing no inconvenience. It reminded him too much of his own childhood, of the boy who'd learned to make himself invisible rather than face another beating. "You don't have to earn your keep," he told her gently. "You just have to be yourself." Tears spilled down her cheeks, not the bitter tears of rejection she'd shed earlier, but something cleaner and brighter. She wiped them away with the back of her hand, trying to maintain the composure that had protected her for so long. Father Benedict seemed to wrestle with himself for a long moment, looking between Ezra's determined face and Maya's hopeful one. Finally, he sighed heavily. "Very well," he said, "but I'll need proper documentation, and we should discuss arrangements for her education. She can read, you said. I've got books. She can learn whatever else she needs to know from living." As Father Benedict hurried away to prepare the papers, Ezra found himself alone with Maya in the gradually emptying square. The other children had slunk away, probably worried about getting in trouble for their earlier cruelty. The adults, too, had drifted back to their business, the excitement over. "Why?" Maya asked quietly, echoing the question that had been burning in Ezra's own mind. He considered lying, offering some practical explanation that would satisfy them both. But something in her eyes demanded honesty, the same honesty he'd always found in the mountains, where pretense was a luxury no one could afford. "Because nobody should have to face the world alone," he said finally, "and because you remind me that there's still some good left worth protecting." She smiled, then really smiled. Not the careful expression she'd worn for the adults, but something genuine and bright as summer sunshine. It transformed her entire face, showing him glimpses of the strong, confident woman she might become with proper care and encouragement. As they waited for Father Benedict to return, Ezra found himself studying his new responsibility with fresh eyes. Maya was small for her age, clearly undernourished, her hair in desperate need of washing and brushing. Her clothes would need replacing before winter, and he'd have to figure out how to manage her special needs in the harsh mountain environment. But beneath the surface problems, he sensed something remarkable, a core of strength that hadn't been broken by years of rejection and hardship. She had survivor's eyes, the same look he'd seen in wild animals that had learned to adapt rather than surrender. "Will you teach me about the mountains?" she asked suddenly. "If you want to learn." "I do." Her voice carried surprising firmness. "I want to learn everything about the animals and the weather, and how to live up there where it's quiet." Ezra felt something stir in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose, direction, the sense that his solitary life might finally mean something beyond mere existence. What neither of them could have known, as they stood in that dusty square making promises to each other, was how much their lives were about to change, or how the mountains would test them both in ways they'd never imagined. The sound of Maya's stomach growling broke the awkward silence as they waited outside the church office, louder than a bear waking from winter sleep. She pressed her hand against her belly, her cheeks turning red with shame. "When did you last eat?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from her thin frame and hollow cheeks. "Yesterday morning," Maya whispered, staring at her worn shoes. "We only get 2 meals at the orphanage, and I gave my dinner to little Tommy. He's been sick." Ezra's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough hungry animals to recognize the signs, the way she held herself carefully, conserving energy, the pale color of her skin. No child should have to choose between her own hunger and helping someone smaller. "Come on," he said, standing up from the church steps. "Papers can wait. Food can't." The diner sat across from the general store, its windows glowing warm yellow in the afternoon light. Ezra had never eaten there before. Too many people, too much noise, but Maya needed proper food, not the jerky and hardtack he usually carried. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and every conversation stopped. Ezra felt the weight of curious stares as he guided Maya to a corner table, her uneven gait making their progress slow but dignified. She kept her chin up despite the whispers that followed them across the room. "Well, I never," murmured Mrs. Henderson, the town's biggest gossip, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "What's that mountain hermit doing with one of the orphanage children?" "Hush," warned her companion, but the damage was already done. Maya's shoulders tensed, and she started to shrink into herself the way Ezra had seen wounded animals do when cornered. "Look at me," Ezra said quietly, leaning across the small table. "Not at them, at me." Maya's storm-gray eyes met his, uncertain but trusting. "Their opinions don't put food on your plate or keep you warm at night," he continued. "Only actions matter, not words. Remember that." The waitress approached with obvious reluctance, her smile forced and brittle. "What can I get you folks?" "Beef stew, cornbread, milk for the girl," Ezra said. "And whatever pie you've got. She looks like she could use some sweetness in her life." When the food arrived, Maya stared at the steaming bowl, as if it might disappear. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the spoon, and Ezra realized she was trying not to wolf it down like a starving animal. "Eat," he said gently. "There's plenty more where that came from." As Maya slowly worked her way through the meal, Ezra found himself studying the people around them. The lumber foreman sat at the counter, his massive hands wrapped around a coffee cup, stolen glances at their table, revealing more curiosity than judgment. A young married couple near the window seemed openly sympathetic, the wife's eyes soft with maternal concern. But it was the table of well-dressed women near the door that made Ezra's blood simmer. They whispered behind their hands, shooting disapproving looks at Maya's patched dress and tangled hair. One of them, a woman with elaborate curls and expensive jewelry, shook her head with theatrical sadness. "Such a shame," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Taking that poor, crippled child up to the wilderness, it's practically criminal." Maya's spoon clattered against her bowl, the joyful hunger in her eyes replaced by familiar hurt. She'd heard such words before, Ezra realized countless times, from countless people who thought her condition made her deaf as well as disabled. But before Ezra could respond, something unexpected happened. The lumber foreman stood up from his stool, his considerable bulk casting a shadow over the gossiping women's table. "Begging your pardon, ladies," he said, his voice polite but firm. "But that man just showed more kindness in 10 minutes than this whole town's managed in 3 years. Maybe we should worry less about judging and more about helping." The fancy woman sputtered, her face turning red. "How dare you?" "Ma'am," the foreman interrupted, tipping his hat. "I've seen plenty of men in my time. The good ones don't need to advertise it, and the bad ones can't hide it. That there's a good man doing a good thing." A murmur of agreement rippled through the diner, and Ezra felt some of the tension leave the room. Maya looked around in wonder, perhaps unused to anyone defending her so publicly. Father Benedict appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath and carrying a leather folder. "Ah, there you are. The papers are ready, if you'd like to review them." They moved to a quiet corner, where Father Benedict spread the documents across the table. Ezra scanned the formal language, his education rusty but adequate. Everything seemed standard until he reached a particular clause that made him frown. "What's this about regular inspections?" he asked, pointing to a paragraph near the bottom. Father Benedict shifted uncomfortably. "Well, given the unusual circumstances, the church board feels some oversight might be prudent. Just to ensure Maya's welfare, you understand." "You mean to make sure I'm not beating her or working her to death," Ezra said bluntly. "Nothing so dramatic," Father Benedict protested, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Simply periodic visits to confirm she's receiving proper care, education, spiritual guidance." Ezra felt Maya's eyes on him, watching to see if this new complication would change his mind. He'd already committed himself, but the thought of church officials tramping through his mountain sanctuary made his skin crawl. "How often?" he asked. "Perhaps quarterly? Reverend Walker is quite concerned about a child living so far from civilization. And if I refuse these visits?" Father Benedict's silence was answer enough. Maya's face fell, the brief hope in her eyes dimming like a candle in the wind. Ezra looked at the girl sitting beside him, this thin, brave child who'd already endured more rejection than most adults faced in a lifetime. The choice was simple, really. His privacy mattered less than her future. "Fine," he said, signing his name with firm strokes. "But they come announced, not sneaking around like they're hunting outlaws." Relief flooded Maya's features as Father Benedict gathered up the papers. "Excellent. I'll send word to Reverend Walker immediately. Maya, dear, you'll want to collect your belongings from the orphanage." "I don't have much," Maya said quietly. "Just some clothes and my doll." The simplicity of her possessions struck Ezra like a physical blow. In his cabin, he had shelves full of books, tools accumulated over years, furniture built to last decades. This child owned so little she could carry it all in her arms. As they walked toward the orphanage, Maya suddenly stopped. "Mr. McCready?" "Ezra's fine, child. We're family now." She smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Ezra, what if I can't do the things mountain people need to do? What if my leg makes me useless up there?" He knelt down on the dusty street, bringing himself to her level despite the curious stares of passers-by. "Maya, I've lived in those mountains for 15 years. You know what's made me survive? Not having perfect legs, or being the strongest man around. It's been about paying attention, being patient, and never giving up when things get hard. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Your leg might work differently than other people's, but your mind works just fine. And in the mountains, your mind's the most important tool you've got. Really? Really? Besides, he added with a slight smile, mountain goats aren't exactly built for flat ground either, but they do just fine where they belong. Maya giggled, the first truly carefree sound he'd heard from her. It was like hearing a stream laugh after winter's thaw, full of life and possibility. But as they continued toward the orphanage, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that their biggest challenges lay ahead. The disapproving looks, the quarterly inspections, the harsh mountain winter coming fast, all of it would test them in ways neither could fully imagine. Still, watching Maya's determined face as she prepared to gather her few belongings, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, not just for her future, but for the possibility that saving her might somehow save himself as well. The orphanage smelled like boiled cabbage and carbolic soap, with an undertone of sadness that seemed baked into the very walls. Maya led Ezra through the narrow hallway, past rooms where children sat on hard benches with nothing to do but wait for a future that might never come. "This is where I sleep," Maya said, pushing open a door to reveal a long room lined with iron beds. Each had a thin mattress, a gray blanket, and a small wooden box underneath for personal belongings. She knelt beside the bed closest to the window, pulling out a battered box that couldn't have held much. Inside were 2 faded dresses, some patched undergarments, a hairbrush with missing bristles, and a small leather-bound book. "What's that?" Ezra asked, nodding toward the book. "Fairy tales," Maya said, clutching it protectively. "It was my mother's. Father Benedict taught me to read with it." Ezra took the book gently, opening to a page illustrated with a brave princess facing down a dragon. The pages were worn soft from countless readings, and he could see where small fingers had traced the words again and again. "We'll keep reading these," he promised, tucking the book carefully into his coat pocket. "Mountains are full of their own kind of magic." As Maya gathered her few possessions, a small voice called from the doorway. "Maya, are you really leaving?" A boy who couldn't have been more than 5 stood there, his eyes wide with worry. This must be Tommy, the child she'd given her dinner to. He was pale and thin, with the kind of cough that spoke of poor nutrition and cold nights. "Yes, Tommy," Maya said softly, moving to kneel beside him despite her awkward leg. "But you're going to be fine here. Mrs. Patterson will take good care of you." "But who's going to tell me stories when I can't sleep?" Maya's eyes filled with tears, and Ezra saw her struggle with leaving this child who clearly depended on her. It struck him that she'd been doing more than just surviving at the orphanage. She'd been caring for others, even when she had almost nothing herself. "I'll tell him stories," offered a voice from behind them. An older girl, maybe 12, stepped into the room. "I know some of the same ones Maya tells." "Thank you, Grace," Maya whispered, hugging the smaller boy tightly. "Be brave, Tommy, and remember what I told you about finding magic in small things." The goodbye was harder than Ezra had expected. Other children appeared to say farewell, some genuinely sad to see her go, others perhaps jealous that she'd found a home when they hadn't. Maya handled it all with dignity beyond her years, promising to remember them and wishing them luck in finding families of their own. Mrs. Patterson, the stern-faced woman who ran the orphanage, appeared as they prepared to leave. "Maya," she said, her voice softer than usual, "you've been a help with the younger ones. I hope you'll be happy in your new home." "Thank you, ma'am," Maya replied politely, though Ezra could see the mixed feelings in her expression. This place had been hard, but it had also been the only home she'd known for 3 years. Outside, Ezra's horse stood patiently at the hitching post, loaded with supplies for the journey home. He'd purchased a smaller saddle in town, one that would fit Maya better and give her something to hold on to during the long ride up the mountain. "Have you ever ridden a horse before?" he asked as he helped her climb up behind him. "Once," Maya said, settling carefully onto the saddle. "Father Benedict let me sit on his old mare when she was sick, but she was standing still." "This will be different," Ezra admitted, "but Dancer here is steady as a rock. She's carried me through storms and snow, never put a foot wrong." As they rode out of Millbrook, Maya twisted in the saddle to look back at the only life she'd ever known. The orphanage grew smaller behind them, along with the general store, the diner, and all the people who'd formed opinions about her based on her twisted leg and patched clothes. "Are you scared?" Ezra asked, feeling her tension through the saddle. "A little," Maya admitted. "Everything's changing so fast. This morning I was just another orphan nobody wanted. Now what am I?" "You're Maya McCready," Ezra said firmly. "My daughter, if you'll have me as a father, and you're going home." The word daughter seemed to surprise them both. Ezra had never imagined himself as a father. His own upbringing had been too harsh and lonely to provide much of a model. But something about this brave, damaged child made him want to try. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of civilization fading behind them as the trail climbed higher into the foothills. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, painting everything golden and peaceful. Maya's grip on his coat gradually relaxed as she got used to Dancer's steady rhythm. "Tell me about your cabin," she said as they paused to rest the horse beside a clear mountain stream. Ezra helped her down, watching as she moved carefully to the water's edge. Her reflection wavered in the current, a thin face with intelligent eyes, hair that would be beautiful once it was properly washed and brushed. "It's not fancy," he said, settling beside her on a fallen log. "2 rooms, 1 for sleeping, 1 for everything else. I built it myself from trees I cut right there on the spot. There's a good well for water, and a root cellar that stays cool even in summer." "Do you get lonely?" Maya asked, trailing her fingers in the cold water. The question caught him off guard with its directness. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but the mountains are good company if you know how to listen to them." "What do they say?" Ezra smiled, charmed by her curiosity. "All sorts of things. The wind tells you when weather's coming. The animals let you know when seasons are changing. Even the rocks have stories if you look close enough." Maya's eyes lit up with interest. "Will you teach me to hear them?" "If you want to learn, I do," she said firmly. "I want to learn everything about being a mountain person." As they continued their journey, the trail grew steeper and narrower. The trees changed from oak and maple to pine and fir, their scent sharp and clean in the thin air. Maya's breathing grew labored with the altitude, but she never complained, even when Ezra could see her struggling. "We'll stop here for the night," he announced as they reached a small clearing he'd used before. "Sun's getting low, and we shouldn't try the last stretch in the dark." He helped Maya down from the horse, noticing how stiff she'd become during the long ride. Her leg clearly pained her more than she was letting on, but she was determined not to be a burden. "Can I help with anything?" she asked as he began setting up camp. "Just rest," Ezra said gently. "Tomorrow will be another long day." But Maya shook her head stubbornly. "I want to learn. If I'm going to be a mountain person, I need to know how to do mountain things." Her determination impressed him. He showed her how to gather dry wood for the fire, how to arrange stones for a safe cooking circle, how to hang their supplies away from curious bears. She absorbed everything eagerly, asking smart questions and remembering his answers. As they sat by the fire that evening, sharing jerky and hardtack, Maya stared up at the star-filled sky with wonder. In town, the lights had blocked out most of the celestial display. Here, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light. "It's so beautiful," she whispered. "So big. Makes you feel small, doesn't it?" Ezra said. "But also like you're part of something bigger than yourself." Maya nodded, understanding perfectly. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the forest owls calling, small animals rustling in the underbrush, the distant howl of a coyote. "Ezra?" Maya said sleepily. "Thank you for choosing me." "Thank you for letting me," he replied, though he suspected he was getting the better end of this bargain. Already, her presence was changing something fundamental in his carefully ordered world. The silence didn't feel so heavy anymore. The future didn't stretch quite so empty. As Maya curled up in his spare blanket beside the dying fire, Ezra found himself making silent promises to this child who'd trusted him with her life. He'd protect her, teach her, give her the childhood she deserved, and maybe in the process, he'd learn what it meant to be truly alive again. But first, they had to make it home, and the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. Maya's scream pierced the morning air like a knife, jolting Ezra from sleep faster than any alarm bell ever could. He rolled from his bedroll with his rifle in hand, scanning the forest for whatever threat had terrified his new daughter so completely. But there was no bear, no mountain lion, no human danger lurking in the pine shadows. Instead, Maya sat frozen beside the cold ashes of their campfire, staring in horror at her left leg. During the night, the limb had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The skin stretched tight and angry red. "I can't move it," she whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "It hurts so much, and I can't make it work at all." Ezra knelt beside her, his experienced hands gently probing the swollen tissue. The leg felt hot to the touch, and he could see dark lines spreading up from her ankle signs that made his stomach clench with worry. "When did this start?" he asked, keeping his voice calm despite the fear racing through his mind. "Last night, after we stopped riding," Maya said through gritted teeth. "But I thought it would get better by morning." "It always gets better by morning." The word "always" hit Ezra like a physical blow. This wasn't the first time Maya's damaged leg had betrayed her, and from her resigned expression, these episodes had been getting worse. How many nights had she suffered in silence at the orphanage, afraid to complain about pain that might make her even less desirable to potential families? "We need to get you to a doctor," Ezra said, already calculating distances and travel times in his head. The nearest physician was back in Millbrook, at least 6 hours of hard riding through mountain terrain that would jar every bone in Maya's body. "No," Maya said firmly, trying to push herself upright despite the obvious agony it caused. "Please, no. If they find out how bad my leg gets, they'll take me back to the orphanage. They'll say you can't take care of me properly." Her fear was so raw, so immediate, that Ezra felt his own heart breaking. She'd rather endure excruciating pain than risk losing the only home she'd ever freely chosen. It was the kind of courage that came from having too little to lose and too much to fear. "Maya, listen to me," Ezra said, taking her small hands in his weathered ones. "Nobody's taking you anywhere. You're my daughter now, and I don't give up on family. But we need to figure out what's wrong so we can help you feel better." He studied the swollen leg more carefully, drawing on years of treating injured animals in the wilderness. The pattern of swelling, the heat, the red streaks, it looked like infection. But from what? Maya hadn't cut herself that he'd seen, hadn't been bitten by anything obvious. Then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Maya's boot on the affected leg was significantly tighter than the other one, the leather straining against the swollen flesh. When had she last had properly fitting shoes? When had anyone checked to see if her footwear was causing damage? "Maya, I need to look at your foot," he said gently. "I think your boot might be part of the problem." She nodded reluctantly, biting her lip as he carefully unlaced the worn leather. What he found underneath made him curse under his breath, a foot covered in open sores and blisters, some fresh, some clearly old and badly healed. The boot had been too small for months, maybe years, slowly torturing her with every step. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I did," Maya whispered, "but Mrs. Patterson said the orphanage couldn't afford new shoes for every child with special needs. She said I should be grateful for what I had." Ezra felt rage building in his chest, not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, deadly fury that came from seeing cruelty disguised as practicality. How many children suffered in silence because adults decided their comfort wasn't worth the cost? "Well, we're fixing this right now," he said, pulling medical supplies from his pack. "And then we're getting you boots that actually fit." He cleaned the infected sores as gently as possible, using precious whiskey to disinfect the wounds. Maya gritted her teeth through the pain, holding her wooden doll so tightly her knuckles went white. "Tell me about your doll," Ezra said, trying to distract her from the medical treatment. "She looks well, loved." "Her name is Hope," Maya said, managing a weak smile. "My mama carved her before I was born. She's all I have left of her and Papa." Ezra paused in his work, studying the small wooden figure more carefully. The craftsmanship was exquisite, delicate features carved with obvious skill and love. Tiny clothes painted in faded but still beautiful colors. This wasn't some mass-produced toy, but a work of art created by loving hands. "Your mother was an artist," he observed. "She carved all sorts of things," Maya said, her voice growing stronger as she talked about happier memories. "Papa said she could make wood come alive with just a knife and some sandpaper. She was teaching me before, before the accident. You remember how to carve? Maya nodded eagerly. Some things. Papa showed me how to hold the knife safely, how to follow the grain of the wood. I used to practice on little scraps. An idea began forming in Ezra's mind, a way to turn this setback into something positive. But first, they had to deal with the immediate crisis of Maya's infected leg. The swelling should start going down in a day or two, he said, finishing the bandaging. But you can't put weight on that foot until it heals properly. And we definitely can't continue up the mountain today. Maya's face fell. I'm sorry I'm so much trouble. Maybe those church ladies were right. Maybe you shouldn't have taken a crippled girl into the wilderness. Maya McCready, Ezra said firmly, using her new name like a shield against doubt. You listen to me good. Your leg doesn't define your worth any more than my scars define mine. We're going to figure this out together, and we're going to make sure you never have to suffer like this again. He fashioned a makeshift stretcher from pine branches and his spare blanket, then carefully moved Maya to a more comfortable spot beside the stream. The cold mountain water would help reduce the swelling, and the sound seemed to soothe her frayed nerves. What happens now? She asked, watching him reorganize their supplies for an extended stay. Now we wait for you to heal, Ezra said simply. And while we wait, maybe you can teach me some of what your mother showed you about carving. I've got plenty of wood, and it sounds like you've got the knowledge. Maya's eyes lit up with something brighter than pain, genuine excitement. Really? You'd want to learn? I figure we're going to have plenty of time to fill over the winter, Ezra said. Might as well learn something useful. As the day wore on, Maya's fever broke, and the angry red streaks began to fade. Ezra made soup from their dried provisions, feeding her small spoonfuls and watching color slowly return to her cheeks. By evening, she was sitting up on her own, eager to examine the piece of pine he'd selected for their first carving lesson. The wood talks to you, Maya explained, running her fingers along the grain. You have to listen to what it wants to become, not force it into what you think it should be. Ezra found himself genuinely fascinated by her knowledge. Despite her young age and limited formal education, Maya understood concepts that had taken him years to grasp in his own woodworking. Her mother had clearly been a gifted teacher as well as artist. Like people, Ezra observed, watching Maya's confident hands guide his clumsy ones. You have to work with what's there, not try to remake it completely. Maya smiled, the first truly peaceful expression he'd seen from her since her leg had betrayed them. Mama used to say that broken things often carve the most beautiful shapes because they've learned how to bend without breaking completely. As night fell around their extended camp, Ezra found himself marveling at the strange turns life could take. Yesterday, he'd been a solitary mountain man with simple plans and predictable routines. Tonight he was a father, teacher, and student all at once, learning patience and wisdom from an 8-year-old girl who'd already survived more hardship than most adults ever faced. But Maya's leg was just one challenge among many waiting for them in the mountains ahead, and Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that their real tests were only just beginning. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the forest like distant thunder, growing louder with each passing second until Maya's eyes widened with unmistakable fear. 3 riders emerged from the morning mist, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces set with grim determination. That's Reverend Walker, Maya whispered, recognizing the lead rider's stern features and black clerical collar. And those men with him? They're from the territorial government. Ezra felt his stomach drop as he recognized the second rider, Judge Harrison, a man known throughout the Montana Territory for his rigid interpretation of law and his deep suspicion of anyone who lived outside conventional society. The third man wore a badge that glinted in the filtered sunlight, marking him as some kind of federal marshal. Mr. McCready, Reverend Walker called out as the 3 men dismounted. We received disturbing reports about this child's condition. Stand aside, please. Reports from who? Ezra asked, moving protectively in front of Maya's makeshift bed by the stream. We've been in the wilderness for 2 days. Judge Harrison stepped forward, his expensive suit looking ridiculous in the forest setting. A concerned citizen in Millbrook observed the child's obvious distress during your departure. Dr. Matthews examined the orphanage records and discovered a pattern of medical episodes that weren't properly disclosed during the adoption proceedings. Maya struggled to sit up straighter, her pale face determined despite the obvious pain movement caused her. Please don't take me back, she said quietly. Ezra's taking good care of me. Better care than I ever got at the orphanage. Child, Reverend Walker said with false kindness, you've clearly been through an ordeal. These infected wounds, the fever, the obvious neglect of your medical needs. Neglect? Ezra's voice carried the dangerous edge of a man pushed too far. I've spent 2 days treating injuries that were caused by boots that didn't fit, sores that festered for months, while your precious orphanage ignored her suffering because fixing it cost too much money. The marshal, a lean man with cold eyes, rested his hand on his gun belt. That's a serious accusation, McCready. You got any proof? Ezra carefully lifted the discarded boot, holding it up so all 3 men could see the bloodstains inside, the way the leather had been stretched and cracked by Maya's swollen foot. Here's your proof. Tell me, Reverend, when's the last time anyone at your orphanage actually looked at this child's feet? A flush of embarrassment colored the clergyman's cheeks, but Judge Harrison wasn't deterred. Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that you've taken a disabled child into wilderness conditions completely unsuitable for her needs. What happens when winter comes? When her condition worsens? The nearest doctor is a day's ride away. The nearest doctor who actually cares about her is sitting right here. Ezra said firmly, I've treated more injuries in the wild than most physicians see in their offices, and I've never once looked at Maya and seen nothing but a burden to be managed. Maya's voice cut through the tense silence like a blade. I'm sitting right here, she said with surprising strength. Don't I get to say what I want? The 3 men looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting resistance from a child they'd assumed would be grateful for rescue. Judge Harrison cleared his throat officially. Young lady, you're not old enough to make decisions that could endanger your life. The territorial government has a responsibility to ensure all children receive proper care. Like the proper care I got at the orphanage? Maya shot back, her storm-gray eyes blazing with anger. Where I went hungry so smaller children could eat. Where I wore boots that tortured my feet because new ones cost too much. Where I was told every day that I was damaged goods nobody would ever want. Reverend Walker shifted uncomfortably. Maya, you're upset and in pain. These aren't the words of a rational child. No, Maya said, struggling to her feet despite Ezra's restraining hand. These are the words of a child who's finally found someone who sees her as more than her broken leg. Ezra doesn't care that I walk funny or need extra help sometimes. He wants to teach me things, to share his life with me. When's the last time anyone at the orphanage asked what I wanted to learn? The marshal stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. This is touching, but the law is the law. Mr. McCready, you've got no legal training in medical care, no experience raising children, and no suitable facilities for a disabled child. The adoption papers are being revoked. On whose authority? Ezra asked, though he could feel the fight slipping away from him like water through his fingers. Judge Harrison produced a folded document from his coat. By order of the territorial court, pending a full investigation into your suitability as a guardian, the child will be returned to the orphanage immediately and examined by qualified medical personnel. Maya's cry of anguish cut through the morning air like a physical blow. She collapsed back onto her blankets, not from physical pain, but from the crushing weight of hope destroyed. Ezra had seen that same look in the eyes of trapped animals the moment when they stopped fighting and accepted their fate. You're making a mistake, Ezra said quietly, kneeling beside Maya and taking her hand. This child doesn't need managing or fixing. She needs someone who believes in her. Mr. McCready, the marshal said with something that might have been sympathy, step away from the child. Don't make this harder than it has to be. But as Ezra looked into Maya's tear-filled eyes, he saw something that stopped him cold. Not surrender, but calculation. Not defeat, but determination. She was planning something, and whatever it was going to surprise everyone. Wait, Maya said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. Before you take me back, I want to show you something. She reached for her wooden doll, cradling it in her lap with obvious love. Then, to everyone's shock, she pulled out a small knife from Ezra's medical kit and began carving delicate shavings from a piece of pine. My mother taught me this before she died, Maya said, her hands moving with confident precision despite her injuries. She said broken things often carve the most beautiful shapes because they've learned to bend without breaking completely. The wood seemed to come alive under her skilled touch, taking shape with an artistry that belied her young age. Within minutes, she'd carved a tiny bird, its wings spread in flight, its features so lifelike, they seemed ready to sing. This is what Ezra sees when he looks at me, Maya continued, holding up the carving. Not a broken girl who needs fixing, but someone with gifts that just needed the right person to help them grow. Judge Harrison stared at the carving in obvious surprise. That's quite remarkable. There's more, Maya said, pulling out several other small figures she'd carved during their journey: a bear, a mountain flower, a perfect miniature of Ezra's cabin based only on his descriptions. He's not just taking care of me, he's helping me become who I was always meant to be. Reverend Walker examined the carvings with growing amazement. These are museum quality, child. Where did you learn such skill? From my mother, who learned from her mother, who learned from hers, Maya said proudly. It's a gift that runs in my family. But at the orphanage, they said it was a waste of time. They said I should focus on learning to be useful in simple ways because my leg made me unsuitable for anything complicated. The three men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. These weren't the crude attempts of a child playing with wood, but the work of a genuine artist, someone with rare talent that deserved nurturing, not suppression. Even so, Judge Harrison said, though with less conviction than before, the medical concerns remain valid. Maya set down her knife and looked directly at each man in turn. I've been in pain my whole life, she said with quiet dignity. But for the first time since my parents died, I'm not in despair. Ezra makes me feel like I have a future worth fighting for. Isn't that worth something? As the morning sun climbed higher through the pine branches, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across their forest clearing, the fate of one small family hung in the balance. And somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled overhead, crying out with a voice that sounded almost like freedom. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the tense silence, sending birds exploding from the trees in a whirlwind of feathers and panic. All eyes turned toward the forest where a massive grizzly bear stood on its hind legs not 50 yards away, blood streaming from a shoulder wound that had only made it angrier. Nobody move, Ezra whispered, his rifle already reloaded and aimed at the wounded animal. Maya, stay exactly where you are. But the bear had caught the scent of Maya's infected wounds, the smell of sickness and vulnerability that predators could detect from miles away. It dropped to all fours and began moving toward their camp with deadly purpose, its massive paws making no sound on the forest floor. Judge Harrison's horse reared in terror, nearly throwing him from the saddle. Do something, he shouted, his earlier authority replaced by raw fear. The marshal drew his pistol, but Ezra shook his head sharply. Too far away, wrong caliber. You'll just wound it worse. Maya watched the approaching bear with surprising calm, her hand resting on her wooden doll. He's not really angry, she observed quietly. He's scared and hurt, just like I was when you found me. Maya, this isn't the time for... Reverend Walker began, but she cut him off. Look at his eyes, she insisted. He's not hunting, he's looking for help. Ezra studied the bear more carefully, his experienced hunter's eye taking in details the others had missed. The animal's gait was uneven, favoring its left side. Its breathing was labored, and there were older scars along its flank that spoke of previous encounters with humans. This wasn't a healthy predator stalking prey. This was a wounded animal seeking something it couldn't quite understand. She's right, Ezra said slowly, lowering his rifle slightly. Look at how he's moving. He's not stalking. He's approaching. The bear stopped 20 feet away and sat down heavily, its massive head tilted to one side as it studied the group of humans. Blood continued to seep from its shoulder wound, not from Ezra's warning shot, but from something older and deeper. There's a trap chain around his neck, Maya said suddenly, pointing to something barely visible beneath the bear's thick fur. It's been cutting into him for weeks. Ezra saw it then, the rusted metal that had been slowly strangling the animal, making it desperate enough to approach humans despite every instinct screaming danger. The bear wasn't threatening them. It was asking for help in the only way it knew how. That's impossible, Judge Harrison stammered. Wild animals don't seek human assistance. Wounded ones do, Maya said firmly, struggling to sit up straighter. When the pain gets bad enough, you'll try anything, even trusting people who might hurt you worse. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was Maya, defending a creature that others saw only as dangerous, recognizing in its desperation something she knew intimately from her own experience. "Mr. McCready," the marshal said nervously, "you need to shoot that animal before it attacks." "No," Maya said with surprising force. "Please, Ezra. He needs help, just like I did. You wouldn't give up on me, don't give up on him." Ezra found himself facing an impossible choice. Every practical instinct told him to eliminate the threat and protect the humans under his care. But looking at Maya's pleading eyes, seeing the wounded bear sitting patiently as if waiting for a verdict, he realized this moment was about more than animal control. "Maya," he said quietly, "if I try to help him and he attacks, people could die. If we don't try to help him, he'll definitely die," she replied. "And we'll become the kind of people who look at suffering and choose to cause more of it instead of less." Judge Harrison started to protest, but Reverend Walker raised a hand to silence him. The clergyman was staring at Maya with something approaching awe, perhaps recognizing the kind of moral courage he preached about, but rarely witnessed. "What do you need?" Ezra asked Maya, making his decision. "Your medical kit, some rope, and everyone else to stay very still," Maya said, already reaching for her wooden doll. "And maybe some of that honey you bought in town." Working together with a coordination that surprised the watching officials, Ezra and Maya approached the bear with careful, deliberate movements. Maya held her doll out in front of her, speaking in soft, soothing tones that seemed to calm the massive animal. "Easy, big fellow," she murmured. "We're here to help, not hurt. I know what it's like to have people look at you and see only problems." The bear's eyes tracked their movement, but it didn't flee or attack. When Ezra reached out slowly to examine the embedded trap chain, the animal actually leaned into his touch, as if desperate for gentle contact after weeks of agony. "This is going to hurt," Ezra warned, working the rusted metal free from infected flesh. "But then, it's going to feel so much better." Maya continued her soft chatter, telling the bear about her own experiences with pain and healing, about finding someone who saw past her damaged leg to the person underneath. Her words seemed to work like magic, keeping the powerful animal calm despite the medical procedure. When the chain finally came free, the bear let out a sound that was part growl, part sigh of relief. Ezra quickly cleaned and bandaged the wound while Maya offered the animal small spoonfuls of honey, which it accepted with surprising delicacy. "There," Maya said finally, scratching behind one massive ear. "Now you can go back to being wild and free, instead of trapped and suffering." The bear looked at her for a long moment, its dark eyes holding an intelligence that made all the watching humans uncomfortable. Then it touched her cheek gently with one enormous paw, a gesture so tender and deliberate that it brought tears to everyone's eyes. Without another sound, the bear stood and walked back into the forest, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of pain finally ended. "Dear God," Judge Harrison whispered, his face pale with shock. "I've never seen anything like that in 30 years of territorial service." Reverend Walker was staring at Maya with obvious wonder. "Child, what you just did, that took a kind of courage and compassion that most adults never develop." Maya settled back onto her blankets, exhausted but triumphant. "Ezra taught me that everything deserves a chance to heal," she said simply. "Even big, scary things that other people want to give up on." The marshal holstered his weapon with shaking hands. "That bear could have killed us all. But he didn't," Maya pointed out, "because sometimes when you offer help instead of harm, you get help instead of harm back." Judge Harrison looked from Maya to Ezra, then back again. Something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what he was witnessing. This wasn't a case of an unsuitable guardian failing to protect a vulnerable child. This was a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values that had just accomplished something extraordinary. "Mr. McCready," the judge said slowly, "perhaps we should discuss the terms of your guardianship more thoroughly." As the afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting everything in golden light, Ezra felt the first stirring of hope that this confrontation might end differently than he'd feared. Maya had shown these officials something they'd never expected to see, not a damaged child in need of rescue, but a young woman of remarkable character, whose gifts were being nurtured rather than suppressed. But the real test was yet to come. Words were one thing. Convincing a territorial court was another entirely. 6 months later, the sound of Maya's laughter echoed off the cabin walls like music, mixing with the steady rhythm of Ezra's axe as he split wood for their evening fire. Snow lay 3 feet deep around their mountain home. But inside, warmth and contentment filled every corner. "Ezra, come look!" Maya called from the table where she'd been working on her latest carving. "I finished the chess set you asked for." He set down his axe and stomped the snow from his boots before entering the cabin's main room. What he saw there took his breath away. 32 perfectly carved pieces, each one a work of art that captured the essence of mountain life. Kings and queens wore the faces of eagles and elk. Knights rode on the backs of mountain goats, and even the humble pawns showed intricate details that spoke of countless hours of patient work. "Maya, this is incredible," Ezra said, picking up the white king to examine its fierce eagle features. "You've outdone yourself." She beamed with pride, her storm-gray eyes bright with accomplishment. The thin, frightened girl from the orphanage had transformed over the winter months into someone confident and capable. Her legs still troubled her on cold days, but Ezra had crafted special boots that supported her properly, and she'd learned to move through the mountain terrain with surprising grace. "Mrs. Patterson would faint if she could see these," Maya said with satisfaction. "Remember how she used to say my carving was just playing with sticks?" A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. 3 sharp raps that meant official business. Ezra's stomach tightened as he recognized the pattern. The quarterly inspection visits had become routine, but they still made him nervous. "Mr. McCready? It's Reverend Walker and Dr. Matthews." Ezra opened the door to find not just the expected visitors, but also Judge Harrison and a woman he didn't recognize. Someone with kind eyes and practical clothes who carried herself with quiet authority. "Good evening," Reverend Walker said, stamping snow from his boots. "I hope you don't mind the extra visitors. This is Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell from the Territorial Education Department." Maya looked up from her chest set with curiosity rather than fear, a remarkable change from her reaction to those first inspection visits. "Good evening," she said politely, though Ezra could see her hand move protectively toward her latest carvings. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes immediately went to the chess set, then widened with obvious amazement. "My word," she breathed, moving closer to examine the intricate pieces. "Did you carve these yourself, dear?" "Yes, ma'am," Maya said, straightening with pride. "Ezra taught me about chess strategy, and I wanted to make a set that felt like our mountains." Dr. Matthews, who'd been Maya's strongest supporter since examining her after the bear incident, smiled broadly. "Mrs. Hartwell, I told you this child was exceptional, but even I didn't expect anything quite like this." "How long did this take you?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, her voice filled with professional interest. "About 2 months," Maya replied. "I work on them in the evenings after my other lessons. Ezra's been teaching me mathematics and geography, and I've been reading every book we can get our hands on." Judge Harrison picked up one of the knights, a mountain goat, so lifelike it seemed ready to leap from the board. "Maya, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "When I first met you, I saw only your limitations. I failed to see your extraordinary gifts." "It's all right," Maya said with the wisdom of someone much older. "Sometimes people can't see past the broken parts to the whole person underneath, but Ezra taught me that's their problem, not mine." Mrs. Hartwell set down the piece she'd been examining and turned to Ezra. "Mr. McCready, I came here today to assess whether Maya was receiving adequate education in this remote setting. I'm prepared to recommend that she be enrolled in our Territorial Gifted program immediately." Ezra felt his heart skip. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mrs. Hartwell explained, "that Maya would attend a special school in Helena, designed for children with exceptional talents. She'd receive advanced instruction in art, mathematics, literature, everything she needs to develop her full potential." Maya's face went pale. "Would I have to leave Ezra?" "During the school term, yes," Mrs. Hartwell said gently. "But you'd return home for summers and holidays. It's an incredible opportunity, Maya. Very few children qualify for such a program." The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Ezra watched Maya's face, seeing the conflict, their excitement about learning warring with fear of separation. After everything they'd been through together, the thought of months apart felt like a physical blow. "What do you think, Ezra?" Maya asked quietly. "Should I go?" He knelt beside her chair, taking her small hands in his weathered ones. "Maya, what do you want? Not what you think I want. Not what you think you should want. What does your heart tell you?" She was quiet for a long moment, studying the chess pieces she'd created with such love and skill. "I want to learn everything I can," she said finally. "But I also want to come home to you. I want to keep carving and living in the mountains and being your daughter." "Then that's what we'll do," Ezra said firmly. "If Mrs. Hartwell thinks you're ready for advanced schooling, we'll find a way to make it work. But this cabin will always be your home, and I'll always be your father." "Mrs. Hartwell smiled warmly. "That's exactly the kind of support system that makes children succeed in our program. Maya, you'd start in the fall term. That gives you all summer to prepare." Reverend Walker, who'd been unusually quiet during the exchange, finally spoke up. "Maya, I also owe you an apology. When I first saw you with that bear, I thought you were being reckless. Now I understand you were being brave. There's a difference." "Thank you," Maya said simply. "But I wasn't being brave by myself. Ezra taught me that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared." Dr. Matthews chuckled. "I think you've been teaching each other quite a lot up here." As the visitors prepared to leave, Judge Harrison lingered behind. "Mr. McCready," he said quietly, "I want you to know that your guardianship paperwork has been made permanent. No more quarterly inspections, no more questions about your suitability. As far as the territorial government is concerned, Maya couldn't ask for a better father." After the officials departed, Ezra and Maya sat by the fire, playing chess with her beautiful handmade set. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their mountain world in peaceful silence. "Are you nervous about the school?" Ezra asked as Maya contemplated her next move. "A little," she admitted, "but mostly excited. I want to learn everything there is to know about art and carving and all the subjects they can teach me. And then?" Maya moved her queen, an elegant elk with antlers spread wide, into position for checkmate. "Then I'll come home and teach other children who feel broken that they're really just different. Maybe some of them have gifts nobody's bothered to look for yet." Ezra smiled, studying the board where his king sat trapped by Maya's brilliant strategy. "I think that sounds like a perfect plan." As the fire burned low and the mountain wind sang softly through the pines, father and daughter sat together in comfortable silence. Outside their warm cabin, the wilderness stretched vast and beautiful under starlight. But inside, surrounded by books and carvings and the deep contentment of family, they'd found something rarer than gold. In the Montana Territory they'd found home. Maya had learned that her worth wasn't determined by other people's judgment but by her own courage and the authentic connections she'd formed. And Ezra had discovered that sometimes the greatest rescue happens in both directions, when two broken people help each other become whole. In the mountains, where survival depended on adaptation rather than conformity, they'd both learned the most important lesson of all, that love isn't about finding someone perfect, but about seeing the perfection in someone others have given up on. The chess game could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, they were simply grateful to be exactly where they belonged.